Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. My guest today wants to remain anonymous. He goes by the name Paradigm Shift on Metabunk. And we talk a lot on Metabunk about 9/11 and 9/11 conspiracy theories. And Paradigm Shift is a proponent of the controlled demolition conspiracy theory, or at least he has a lot of questions which lead him to think that it's quite a plausible reality that the World Trade Centers would have been destroyed by explosives and not just by the planes flying into them. We butted heads on Metabunk a few times, and I thought it would be good to have a one-on-one discussion so we could kind of understand better where the other person is coming from. This is one of my longer podcasts at an hour and a half, but it's very interesting if you want to try to understand why somebody believes in a conspiracy theory like the 9/11 controlled demolition conspiracy theory, or if you're just interested in the various 9/11 conspiracies. So here he is, Paradigm Shift. All right, so welcome to the show, Paradigm Shift, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me on, Mick. It's actually my time on a podcast like this, so I'm actually kind of excited to be able to engage in this.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you is that we've been talking on Metabunk, and we've been having a variety of disagreements about different things, and specifically you're very interested in talking about 9/11 related topics. And so, you know, we've kind of butted heads on Metabunk a bit, and I think it's good just to talk to someone directly, and you know, you get much better communication when you're actually just talking by voice rather than typing stuff out. So I think it's a good opportunity for me to explain myself to you and for you to explain yourself to me. So I'd like to just talk about the topics in general. That's all sound all right?
Yeah, that's fair. So basically you want to talk about because when we were discussing actually starting the podcast, you were interested that I said I used to believe the official story and that I actually changed my mind about it. Yeah, so basically just some background about me. I'm actually just a university student in my final year. I study politics and journalism. And so incidentally, actually, my best subject in high school was physics. So I have a slight background. I wouldn't say I'm an expert or anything, but I happen to know some of the basics involved when it comes to some of the terms that people mention, like, you know, free fall and all that stuff. So I kind of understand some of the science that goes behind that, although I wouldn't say I'm an expert, and I'm still trying to understand it a bit better. And I'd say that from what I've noticed from your site is that actually, and I've tried to make this point actually, that you do a good job for debunking a lot of things that are false. And I think that needs to be clarified, that I don't necessarily think that, you know, anyone who disagrees with what I'm saying or what is contrary to popular belief is all wrong. There are good points on both sides and bad sides on both points, and that's kind of my perspective on it. So I'll just get a little bit deep into that. So basically, I grew up with kind of neutral to 9/11. Like, I'm just, essentially you could say, let's just keep it at that. I'm a foreigner, basically, so I don't have any direct ties to the U.S. or to Al-Qaeda or whoever was supposed to be involved. I'm just a neutral third party. So I was pretty much exposed to 9/11 as a child through the media, word of mouth, movies, articles, whatever people would say. So I never really gave it much of a second thought. I kind of just went with the official narrative as it was. And then, you know, as I started getting a little bit older, especially in school, you know, it started to become a little bit more of a topic to talk about, you know, in classes, having little debates with your friends, just talking about things that are of concern. And you actually start to find out a little bit more that you maybe didn't know. So I was still under the impression for a while that, everything's fine. The official story that we live kind of in a, and I think you would probably agree with this too, that most people are pretty ignorant of some of the realities of the world in terms of political, economic statuses. I just want to know if you would agree with that, at least on a very vague level.
Yeah, I'd say so, because I think most people are, they don't really follow foreign affairs very much. Then most people are generally just interested in the things around them. And a lot of people don't even watch the news. So, certainly I would say most people are ignorant of world affairs. I wouldn't like to call use the term ignorant in a that pejorative way, though. It's kind of like they just don't
yeah,
follow it. They're not interested in
term,
it.
Yeah, agreed. And and I'd like to make the distinction that it's not willful ignorance. It's more of just the world is just so overly saturated with so many different topics that it isn't. I wouldn't expect every single person to focus on just one thing. Like obviously there's going to be a few people who focus on a few things, like you and me here, and other people who focus on other things that are probably more important to them and for the field that they're in. For me, it just so happens that, because I'm involved in politics and journalism, it happens to be such a big political event, right? Something that spurred things like the Patriot Act, the countless wars that have been going on in the Middle East and all that stuff. So to me, it does signify a big historical event that perhaps requires some clarification, because there is, in my point of view, and I would think this of a lot of people as well, although I'm not going to speak for anyone else, just myself, that there is some clarification still needed about 9/11. There is still some mystery and some things that haven't been answered, and mistakes were made, yes, but it's a matter of I think essentially that we don't have the complete story, and that's pretty much my stance.
Yeah. No, and that's fair enough. I mean, a lot of people would argue that there's questions regarding, like, even just at the very simplest level, something I talk about is, like, was there incompetence that was covered up during the response to 9/11, just under the conventional official story? There's things like, jets being sent in the wrong direction, things like that. Yeah, there are obviously questions about, 9/11 that remain unanswered to this day. Like, we don't know exactly who paid for the hijackers, for example, if, just assuming the official story is correct, or even if it isn't, obviously some people got on those planes. What exactly did they do? We don't know, exactly what happened, and we don't know exactly what happened in the planes. And there's obviously things from, like, physics point of view that we don't know. We don't know exactly what happened inside each of the buildings because, they were on fire and there was a lot of smoke and you couldn't see. So there's uncertainties and unknowns about 9/11. I think there always will be. And but you're focusing on ones that you think that we could actually get answers to.
I think that's it's a reasonable statement. Not necessarily that we could get answers to, but perhaps some answers that we might have even been misled on, and possibly not answers that, not questions that we could get answers to, but perhaps clarified, if you understand what I mean. At least shed more light on, if not completely answer.
Right. Well, just like lay our cards on the table here. Like, would you describe yourself as someone who you think it was like a controlled demolition, or you suspect it might be a controlled demolition, like say the collapses of Building 7?
I suspect that. Basically my stance is not that I suspect it was a controlled demolition necessarily. It's just that some of the evidence and even looking at the buildings might indicate that. For me, the one of my main contentions was NIST refusing to test for the possibility of controlled demolition, refusing to test for explosives when there were multiple eyewitnesses who saw explosives, including first responders, eyewitnesses who were both in the buildings prior to the impact and after, before the onset of collapse, and policemen, reporters being recorded on camera. The way people describe the explosions, they heard big booms, or they heard a series of explosions, and it's just in a terrorist attack. It just seems odd to me that explosives wouldn't be tested for. I mean, forget even in the controlled demolition scenario, it doesn't necessarily mean inside job. It could still have been a pre-planned job by the supposed terrorists who are the suspects, and even in that scenario, I would think that it deserves to be tested for, because that could indicate a much possibly larger plan that they were involved with because ultimately 9/11 was a successful conspiracy by Al-Qaeda. And see, those facts I'm not disputing. For me, it's just how the buildings came down, mainly the science behind NIST's report.
Right.
To me, a lot of it is just questionable.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. I've read the NIST report quite extensively and looked at the science, and from my perspective, it seems okay. And the thing that really gets me about this idea that there might be explosives, and I think that most people who aren't really familiar with the topic, that the fact is that a plane flew into each building, and created this giant hole in it. And then had this raging fire for 50 minutes, like an hour and a half or whatever it was for each one. And it seems unnecessary to have any other mechanism there. It would seem just the fact that the planes, the planes flew into the building themselves. Why isn't that enough, in your opinion, to explain the collapse of the buildings?
Well, firstly, it was the fact of asymmetric damage causing symmetric collapse. But not just that, the Empire State Building, another building in New York, had previously been hit by a plane, a B-52 bomber, sometime in the 60s, I believe. Arguably, yes. I know that it isn't the same size of a plane. It wasn't traveling at the same speed. It wasn't carrying as much fuel. I understand all of that. However, I do not think that an impact from a plane that causes asymmetric damage would necessarily cause significant damage to make the building collapse the way that it did in near free fall speeds. When the Empire State sustained minimal fire damage, and practically none of the floors had collapsed or given way structurally, and that's still a large object colliding with the building high up on its structural point.
I must say I'm kind of surprised you bring up that as an example, because most people, it seems like a overly simplistic example, because the Empire State Building is such a different building to the World Trade Center towers.
I agree with all that. I mean, yeah, I agree, but just from like you say, from a simplistic comparison, it is odd, especially when you look and you see, okay, a building has been hit with a plane before, it hasn't come down.
Yeah.
And then you see that, NIST didn't test for explosives, despite a good reason for them to have tested for them in a terrorist attack. And then you also see that it is the first time that fires have brought down skyscrapers 3 times in one day. And NIST came up with a whole new type of fire-induced progressive collapse, a new type of collapse.
I think that's kind of a bit of a misleading thing, saying that they came up with a new thing. It was the first time it was observed, I guess.
Fair enough. Not that they came up with one, that they said they had shown for the first time, and I think I'm almost directly quoting Shyam Sunder here. He said that they have shown successfully for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse. So it was the first time that they had seen that type of progressive collapse successfully happen in a building, and that the first time they were able to record and prove it through their science. So to me, it's just odd that they would find a new type of collapse rather than look at alternatives for that kind of collapse of a building that is already known, which is a controlled demolition.
But again, with Building 7, there were very dramatic and unique circumstances there already. Like World Trade Center 1 collapsed, right next to Building 7, and created significant damage and lots of fires in World Trade Center 7, and then they weren't able to fight the fire because I think first of all they had problems with water, then they got water, and then eventually it was decided it was too dangerous for the firefighters to stay in the building, so they're just going to let it burn. And of course they had lots of other things to do that day because it was this huge disaster area. So it doesn't seem, it's not like just an ordinary building catching fire and then collapsing. It was extraordinary circumstances. So the fact that there was an extraordinary outcome, to me, doesn't seem, that unexpected. You would expect weird things to happen. Like when you fly a 767 into a 113-story building, you don't know what's going to happen, because it's not, despite the Empire State Building thing, this really hasn't happened before. The World Trade Center was a unique construction, very, very different. So you've got something that's not happened before, and then something happens and you say, oh, that's never happened before. you'd expect things that haven't happened before to happen on that day because it was an extraordinary day.
And I agree with that. It was an extraordinary day, extraordinary set of circumstances, as you said with the water situation. Actually, I'm aware that the water mains were burst underneath the buildings. From what I understand, can you correct me if I'm wrong on that?
Yeah, I think there was some damage when World Trade Center 1 collapsed, which that was the second building to collapse, and obviously it was right next to Building 7. There was one building separating them, but it was essentially, it ripped like gouges in the south face of Building 7. But I think they did set up water later. I'm not sure. I think there's some dispute about exactly the availability of water on that day. But at some point, eventually, they abandoned the building and they weren't fighting the fires. There's a video that was shot briefly before the collapse, like about 20-30 minutes before the collapse, and you see the fires raging all the way around the building, and there's no firefighters near it. So they definitely just basically let it go. And of course, they said that they did that. There's interviews with firefighters who said that they thought the building was going to collapse, and so they moved out. And then there's the famous quote from what's his name, the owner of the building. I can't remember his name now.
Larry.
Yeah. He said that the firemen said that it was too dangerous, and so they were going to pull it. And people say that pull it meant demolish it, but really it just meant he was going to pull the firefighters out, pull the operation, cancel it.
I've seen that, and honestly, that to me isn't convincing evidence in support of my argument, because that's just semantics essentially, and you can speculate on what they meant with that term. However, it's not hard evidence, it's not hard scientific evidence, and I'd rather not focus on speculation like that with what people said in certain situations. And I understand that. I understand that the firefighters had to pull it. It was that they were concerned that the conditions in the building were not safe for them to enter. I'm aware of that. However, for me, one of the problems with fires in World Trade Center 7 is that it's not evident to me that the fires were really as raging as they claim to be by NIST and by people who say that the buildings came down by fire, because I've watched videos of the fires and they do not look as intense as fires of, say, buildings that, basic video, if you look up like World Trade Center 7 versus other skyscraper fire buildings, and you'll see that there's been much worse building fires, and those structures are still, like, if not completely standing, at least mainly standing in terms of their structure, not completely reduced to their rubble and their own footprint.
Yeah.
And back to what you said about extraordinary circumstances and an extraordinary day. I mean, that is a bit of a loose generalization in my opinion, because extraordinary events that occur out of extraordinary circumstances could be a range of things, and to me it's just extremely, it's much too extraordinary, borderline miraculous for the three buildings that day to have all collapsed in a similar fashion out of asymmetrical damage. And so all of them collapsed in a similar manner despite the fact that the damage to these buildings was different in each case.
How are you saying that they're similar, though? Like, the World Trade Center tower collapses was nothing at all like the Building 7 collapse. World Trade Center towers, like, I have a model of the World Trade Center here, they started collapsing from the top. And this chunk of the top of the building kind of crushed the bottom of the building. Well, not crush exactly, but it caused it to disintegrate.
Well, and
this building just went straight down.
And that's an issue with Newton's laws of motion, actually. The fact that the top of the building can crush the bottom and essentially disintegrate it, because, as we know from Newton's third law of motion, every force creates an opposite and equal reaction. If the top parts of the building are falling, they will equally, so as each floor crushes a floor that it comes into contact with, they will both equally destroy each other with the same amount of energy. So say at the top you have those 15 floors, they will, and given for gravity and the additional kinetic energy, gravitational potential energy that they'll receive from falling, they'll probably take out a bit more than 15 floors. I can't be exact here because I don't have the right numbers and all that with me. But I'm just going to estimate and say it'll take out 15 plus. So only be able to take out 15 plus the amount of energy that is stored within those top 15 floors, and only take out 15 plus below it before the machine comes to a halt. Because that's just the laws of conservation of momentum.
Well, yeah, it would be if it was as simple as that. But have you ever heard like the explanation that I give, like for how the buildings collapse, how the World Trade Center towers collapse?
You'd have to refresh me.
So, you familiar with the way the World Trade Center towers? Say, let's just go with WC2, for example. They're a tube in a tube design. You're familiar with that description? And that they have a core.
The tube in the tube. So you have the vertical tube attached to an outside vertical tube.
Yeah, it refers to like the outside of the building is say one tube, and then the core of the building, where all the elevators and the steps are, and the the mechanical rooms are, that is another tube. It's like it's more like almost like a central core, and then the building is around that central core. So that's the structure of the building is actually very, very different to conventional buildings like the Empire State Building, for example, which is a much older building, because it has these very, very long floors, very open, lots of open space, because there's no columns anywhere between the core of the building and the outside. So you've got these wide open floors. Which is a very distinctive feature of the building when it was built. Everyone remarked upon it, how kind of unique it was, and other buildings have done similar things since. But this is understanding this layout is vital to understanding why it collapsed the way it did and why it isn't actually violating Newton's laws of motion. Now the floors are made up of these basically trusses, metal trusses with corrugated metal on top of them, and then I think a layer of like 3 to 6 inches of concrete, lightweight concrete on top of that. And so that goes from the core of the building to the outside of the building. Now, the outside of the building is only attached to the core via these trusses, via these floor panels, and some beams at the corners, which are just basically on the edges of these trusses. So if something fell from above and stripped away the floors from between the core and the outside wall, then the outside wall is no longer supported, it's no longer held in. It goes from being a column that is supported at every 13 feet or whatever, to being a slender column which isn't supported at all, and it just becomes this floppy skin. And even if there was nothing else going on, it wouldn't be able to stand by itself because it's not supported from the inside, so it would collapse. But it's also got this huge amount of mass falling down on it. Now, you talk about the top of the building kind of being balanced by the damage it does to the bottom of the building. Well, you got to think of it in terms of two things. There's the columns, and then there's the floors, which are the floor panels. So the weight of the building is held by the columns, specifically the core columns, but also the perimeter columns as well. That's what's holding the building up. The floors themselves, the floor panels, are just kind of attached to the core and the outside wall. So the floor that you walk around when you're inside the building, that's not holding up the building. That's just something that's being held up by the columns and is also bracing connecting the columns one to another. So if something were to fall and strip away that floor, it wouldn't have to damage the columns at all. It would just go through that floor and that would fall down, and it would strip away the next floor, and it would strip away the next floor. And once it stripped away enough floors, you would see the remaining columns wouldn't have any lateral support. So a combination of that lack of lateral support and all this debris falling and everything going on would cause it to collapse. And this is something you can actually see in the collapse pictures, is that after the collapse wave has reached the ground, about half of the core is actually still standing for a few seconds because the floors have been stripped away, and you can kind of see the way it peels away from the outside perimeter. It's not that it's destroying the core. It's not like crushing these core columns. It's the huge mass of the building on top, which is stripping the floors away from the core and stripping them away from the outside walls, and that's what actually causes the collapse. I don't know if that it made sense to you, because it was about kind of rambling on a bit, but that's how I explain why it doesn't break the laws of physics.
Okay. I understand that. Now, thank you for refreshing me, because I actually had seen this explanation, and it's good to know exactly what it is I'm up against. But basically, so even then, as you say, these floors are falling. The building still fell within near free fall acceleration, which, as even Shyam Sundar stated, for free fall to occur, that would mean there was no objects below the falling object. That means there's no resistance underneath it. And the building did fall through the path of it did not fall through the path of least resistance. It fell into itself, into its own mass. And as each floor coupled onto the next floor, there was no observable deceleration, as you would observe when two objects collide and impact. It was almost as if each successive floor was already weakened or taken out, or however you want to put it, before the previous floor had made contact with it. They all just fell synchronously. Well, you would still notice some form of deceleration, and that is also part of Newton's second law, which is force equals mass times acceleration, which is where when you have the mass accelerating and these opposing forces will now enact Newton's third law, which is that they destroy each other because of the mass and acceleration.
See, that's interesting.
Not only would the floors destroy each other upon contact, you would also notice a visible deceleration, which would not translate into a near free fall collapse of a building, because that near free fall collapse, at least from what I've seen, has only been demonstratively done through controlled demolition, which is why it is a good hypothesis. I'm not saying that it's for sure. I'm just saying it's a hypothesis they should have not ruled out so easily.
Well, you know that if you're saying it's similar to controlled demolition, surely an argument would also be that it looks nothing at all like a controlled demolition. Like controlled demolitions, they blow away the columns at the bottom of the building and they use the weight of the building to destroy itself. They don't plant explosives on every floor.
WTC7 looks just like that.
It does, yeah, but then are you arguing that WTC7 is a controlled demolition, but the other ones are not?
Yeah, and you have different types of controlled demolitions. I mean, you have gravity-driven controlled demolitions where they split the building from half to see what it looks like when you have half the building falling onto the other half, to demonstrate Newton's third laws of motion, how you have equal masses canceling out each other and destroying each other equally. So you have different types of controlled demolitions. I'm not saying that they could have. I mean, if they were, how do you know they couldn't have been different types of controlled demolitions? Perhaps different types for you. So that's why I'm saying, like, different hypotheses. That hypothesis shouldn't have been so easily excluded when there are still ad hoc alternatives. You could come up to just the one controlled demolition scenario.
I think, to be honest, they didn't do it because it seemed like such a ridiculous idea, because it was fairly obvious that the planes had flown into the buildings and there was a big fire, and that once the collapse had started, there was no way of stopping it. And I think part of the problem is they didn't actually model the full collapse progression because they didn't think it was necessary, because obviously it was going to fall. So you don't get the detail of why it was so fast. What I was just talking about there with things falling through the floors rather than falling through the columns is the reason why it fell at, I think, like about 80% of gravity or something like that. Something fairly close to free fall, but not actually free fall.
I agree. It wasn't exactly free fall. There was some resistance, but it was negligible enough to be within a good parameter of free fall that is not consistent with the natural collapse of buildings due to fire or any other kind of natural structural weakening.
I think that when people say that it's not consistent with it, they're kind of thinking about this oversimplification of it. That it's just there's the top part, there's the bottom part, and the top part crushes the bottom part equally. That's not what's happening. It's almost like the building is, and this kind of sounds silly, like a giant zipper, and you're pulling down the zipper. It takes a little bit of force to pull the zipper down, and then the building falls apart. Because you've got the outside of the building connected to the inside of the building via these floors. And the floors themselves are really weak structurally. They're not designed to carry a structural load. They're designed to carry people in an office. So they carry their own weight, and then they carry the live load, which is the people moving around and if any equipment's on it. And they have like a safety margin, I think, of 6 times their own weight being just laid on top of it. So if you have something that can only just support 6 times its own weight on top of it, but then you drop something from 12 feet above it, then it doesn't seem at all surprising that that floor would give way. The columns don't give way. The floor just gets stripped away from the columns, and now you've got 2 floors falling down, and they strip away other floors. And they're not going to be floors. They're not going to be like, these neat slabs falling down. It's going to break up. It's going to be this huge amount of debris. It's going to be like dumping a bag of rocks. Let's say somebody took, I don't know, it's like, if somebody dropped an avalanche on your house, you wouldn't be surprised if your house got destroyed, even though it's only a bunch of snowflakes. It doesn't have to be a solid object hitting something to actually do a lot of damage. So, if you think dropping a huge bag of rocks on top of the World Trade Center would do this thing, it would strip away these floors. The floors would be stripped from the walls, and then the walls would collapse.
I mean, that is a fairly simplistic explanation in and of itself. And just one thing that I have to point out is that you do keep avoiding the fact that NIST hasn't tested or refused to test for explosives. And the most you've responded to that is literally just to say that it's a ridiculous hypothesis. And
I said they would think it's ridiculous because they understand why the building's collapsed.
But that's not really fair. And see, and with NIST, like, I'm surprised I haven't brought this up. With NIST, one of the things that just sticks out to me is that NIST is a government agency. Why were they tasked to investigate the collapse of the buildings when there was... So they had released this report. Can you remind me when exactly they released their report and when they were commissioned to investigate the collapse of...
I think it was 2008, was it? They started in 2006 and they finished 2008. I'm just going off the top of my head here. I'll check real quick.
Yeah. I also think it was around that time. I was going to suggest 2007 myself, but it was around that ballpark. So let's just, if you want to look it up to be sure, I'm satisfied with just keeping it around that.
Yeah, 2008.
In any case, because it doesn't take away from the main point that I'm making is that by that time there was already enough kind of doubt within the American public by around 2005, 2006 that perhaps all the questions weren't being answered by 9/11 because World Trade Center 7 hadn't been mentioned in the commission report, because the commission report was, as we know, by the chairs of the commission themselves, who went on to write a book about it, that it was set up to fail, underfunded, conflict of interest, all of that.
That wasn't NIST, though. That was the 9/11 commission report.
The 9/11 commission, yes. But so you had the 9/11 commission not mentioning WTC7. So NIST was a response to the outcry of WTC7 not being looked into. And so at a time when the government was already kind of held in question by the public, it's surprising that the government would kind of hire themselves to investigate themselves. It's like, if someone is a suspect in a crime, you don't get the same department to investigate themselves, which is just, that to me is a conflict of interest.
I don't think they were thinking of it in terms of investigating themselves. They were just thinking of figuring out why the building collapsed. See,
it is a government agency who is funded directly by the government. And you know this, Mick. Like, if a study, like say a study...
Oh, I understand what you're saying.
And you know this with the tobacco industry against marijuana and alcohol, how they funded studies against their competitors. So it's just the same way with this. If they're being funded by the government, what inclination do they have to pursue hypotheses that might implicate the government?
Yeah, that's true. But NIST did investigate the possibility of an explosion. There's a section in the building where they try to figure out, like, could the building have been brought down by explosives, and I think they even did a simulation with it.
NIST said in a press conference that they did not test for explosives.
They
but
didn't
did not
test for
evidence
explosive.
of explosives.
Yeah, they didn't test for explosive
Because
residue, but they did test basically the sound levels that would have been created by the explosives, and since there was no audible explosions, then they
were
started.
audible explosions. Could you explain to me what their methodology for going about assessing the sound of explosives on 9/11 was? Because I'm not entirely familiar with that.
Yeah, they basically they said that if there were explosives, then it would have to have brought down this column because they knew the order at which the building collapsed. So they said column 79 would have had explosives at the bottom. And so they said, like, what would it take to cut column 29 in a way that it would fail like suddenly, like the way it did? And they came up with a certain amount of cutter charges, and then they figured out what the decibel level would be, like half a mile away from the building where there were lots of people.
Yeah.
And
so was it just one specific type of explosive that they used?
Yeah, they only did.
No.
No, obviously, like the excuse around that is that they use quieter explosives or something like that. But to be honest, I think they were just giving it. I think they did more than I would have expected them to do by even giving people the benefit of looking into explosives. Because I think with World Trade Center 7, it does look like a controlled demolition in terms of the visuals of the building coming down. It really doesn't sound like one, though. So it seems very, very different to your conventional controlled demolition.
Well, about going back to your point about that you think that they did more than they needed to, I think that is an unfair statement to say, considering that we did just say that they did not test for explosive residue, that they claimed that there was no reason to test for explosives because they had no evidence that explosives were used, based on what, a preconceived notion that they would not find any?
Well, no, I think it's based on the fact that World Trade Center 1, a very, very tall skyscraper, basically fell against the south side of the building and set it on fire. So now you're positing that there's also explosives when you've got this perfectly reasonable explanation for why it fell in the first place. When they investigated it, they didn't know exactly the sequence of events, and they still probably don't know exactly what the sequence of events was. But they knew why it fell. They knew that a building fell on top of it and that it was badly damaged, and then it caught fire, and then 5 hours later it collapsed. They didn't know the exact details, and that's what the investigation was for. So I think from their perspective...
But testing one kind of specific explosive on a specific column in a specific controlled manner that would obviously give the result that would show that it wasn't explosives that's not a good test. That they barely tested it at all. How could you say that?
Well, it eliminates
them?
One type of demolition, like conventional controlled demolition.
It eliminates one of several, which is not an accurate or scientific test at all. In fact, it's quite an unscientific method when you test for hypotheses. If I were to go in the ocean and take a cup, take a scoop of water, look at it, and say, there must be no whales in the ocean because I've looked at that cup of water in my hand. That's not scientific testing.
Doesn't really seem like the same type of thing that you're testing. You're not.
It sort of is. If you're only testing for one type of explosive in a specific kind of environment, you tested it for what the column 79 is that one in World Trade Center 7 or the World Trade Center 1 or 2?
I don't think that they were saying that there's zero possibility that explosives were used. I think they were saying
that's what they said. That's clearly what Shyam Sundar said. He said clearly that there's no possibility for evidence of explosives having been used, and there's no need to test for them.
Well, I think he's saying that there's a lack of evidence for it. He doesn't saying that
and that's the problem. It's not that there's a lack of evidence. It's willful ignorance of the evidence that you should test for explosives.
But you personally, would you say, are you already convinced that there were explosions in World Trade Center 7 even without tests for residue?
No. I just think that it's ridiculous to say that there isn't when you haven't even tested for them. I think that there's a possibility of it. For sure, I'm not entirely convinced, but I just think that it's not scientific and it's not objective to be able to say it definitely wasn't that when you haven't even tested for it, or if you did a shoddy test.
Let's try something. Like a while ago, you said like you didn't think the fires were very intense. I've got a YouTube video that I don't know if you've seen, but I wonder if you could just look at it now, and we'll just pause the recording, or like we'll just do I'll edit it out, and I could send this to you. Let's see. I'm just going to send you the link in Skype. It's like 2 minutes long. We could just look at it and see. Just watch it real quick and see if it changes your opinion on how intense the fires were at all.
Okay.
Or we could hit play at the same time, so we're both watching it.
Oh, I'm currently at 10 seconds in.
All right, I shall go to 12 seconds. Play.
So, wait, I'm playing, okay.
Okay. So I'm seeing windows with pretty roaring fire like shooting out of it.
Yeah, and I agree that it's a fire, undeniably, and I don't disagree that it was hot fire. Fire is always hot. And I don't disagree that if you were caught in those fires, you would have most likely died or suffered from asphyxiation. I do not deny all of that. My only qualm is, and so since you showed me this video, and do you want me to watch the full length of it?
Yeah, let's go through it all, and we can talk about what we see. Now we're seeing like swirling smoke on the.
So right now I'm seeing smoke about halfway around the building.
That's the west side.
Most of the building looks fine. I see fire in one window near the bottom panel, and I was just zoomed down, and I can see more windows on fire.
Yeah, that's like one floor.
It seems to be a very minimal portion of the building.
Well, it's 4 floors by the looks of it. In terms of, this is actually quite late in the process. What we're seeing now is a wider shot. You can see there's 4 floors worth of windows destroyed, but only 2 floors are currently on fire. Now it's zooming in, and you can see like the ceiling is kind of sagging down. That's probably just the false ceiling, the panels and stuff.
And actually, just share 1 minute 15 actually. Is around, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe right there, 1 minute 15 seconds is at the time or just before the onset of collapse, I believe, perhaps within 10 to 15 minutes, maybe. I could be wrong, but apparently this was one of the pieces of evidence that NIST used as a still to point out that fires were burning on certain floors where they weren't. They had marked that fires were burning on floors 7 through 9, when clearly only 2 of said floors are actually burning.
Yeah,
that you can see visibly the window smashed out.
At that point, something fell down. I'm looking at the fires. They seem very wind-driven and very, very strong to me. Like this, it's zoomed in right now. I don't know if you're just watching the same bit. I'm at like 225. There's, very, very strong. We're nearly at the end now. But, obviously it's a big building. So even though the fires are only on a few floors, that's still, quite a bit of fire. In terms of the damage it can do.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Like, it's definitely like, that's a bad fire, by all means. Although, if you care to look at the link I just sent to you, if you see the fires that were raging on those buildings, you would see a considerably noticeable difference. Yeah,
well, I see the first one that's done is the Windsor Tower in Madrid. Are you familiar with that one? It's the first thing that they show in the video you just sent to me. And that's actually one of my favorite examples for a building that nearly collapsed due to fire. It's the top half of the building collapsed around the core, and it was stopped, I think, by a mechanical flaw that was like halfway down the building. But it did actually you can see it all falling down there. That's quite dramatic. Sorry, you're not watching the same thing, but
my main point is how intense the fires are. It's significantly more intense on the Madrid building.
It's at night, which I think makes it kind of misleadingly more intense.
Yeah, agreed. The night can enhance the contrast, but you can't deny the size of the flames themselves.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But you only need one floor to fail.
The coverage of the building that it's burning as well. and the area, the surface area of the building that's being burnt as well.
Uh-huh.
It looks like the
Yeah.
building is much more encapsulated in fire in Madrid than World Trade Center 7.
Well,
In World Trade Center 7, honestly, I can only see at max like 7 to 10 floors burning, whereas with Madrid, almost the entire building is burning.
yeah. Well, if you look at the south side, you see a lot of smoke, and you don't really know what's going on behind that smoke. But it seems to be smoke coming from every single floor on the south side. But yeah, I think these are arguments that people have been having for many, many years, and maybe we can kind of discuss it in a little more of a meta sense. Why do you think no progress ever gets made? If you're relatively young, you're in your 20s, you're a student. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm in my mid-20s.
Okay. So you would have been just a kid when 9/11 happened, and you just grew up with it, and eventually you learned more about it and became suspicious and got interested in the topic. But it's nearly 20 years now, 18 years, and nothing's really changed in the 9/11 truth movement in probably the last 12 years or so since.
That's arguable. I mean, architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth has grown from 1,000 members when it started to 3,000 plus now. Right now, Dr. Leroy Halsey is working on his project on why WTC7 fell at the University of Fairbanks, Alaska, or University of Alaska Fairbanks, however the order of that is. You have the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth pushing forward their grand petition jury, their grand jury petition hearing for grand jury, however it's called.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a lot of movements that are actually making a bit more of you could say progress, at least a push, maybe awareness. But I would agree with you generally in that, even though that's the problem though. It isn't. I would agree with you that overall, despite those minor achievements, they haven't made much progress. Although that's not really indicative of whether their information is credible or true or not. There are tons of people who have plenty of credible ideas that are really worthwhile, but just never get heard. And that's just the case for something that, with 9/11 specifically, conspiracy theory is seen as a pejorative, seen as a taboo, seen as one of those topics that people don't like to discuss because it's either too controversial, it offends people, brings up past traumas. Some people just don't like to talk about politics. So unfortunately, 9/11 happens to fall into that category of people just don't want to talk about politics. Forget conspiracy theories. It's just politics people don't like a lot of the times. So that's the one part of it. The other part is that, there's the media. That's a very powerful institution. When they hammer home how 9/11 happened, and media theory says that the first story is what sticks people the most. When 9/11 did break, it was the mainstream media who reported it exactly as the U.S. wanted them to. How was it that the mainstream media on the day of 9/11 was already telling everyone it was Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden without any sort of investigation?
Well, I think they probably based it on the previous attacks on the World Trade Center towers and the threats that had been made by Al-Qaeda.
Which is just an assumption and speculation, which we could agree is widespread conspiracy theory, fear-mongering.
Well, I wouldn't say I'd call it that. I would say it's they made an assumption that the most likely candidate for it would have been some kind of jihadist terrorists because of the previous attack and the threat to the World Trade Center.
Which pushed the war to go into Iraq.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, obviously, you can make the case, obviously, that it was a convenient excuse to go to war, and therefore, maybe someone did it because they wanted to go to war. But then you could also just make the case that they simply exploited the event. They were glad that it happened rather than they made it happen. But just getting back to
in either case, it's indicative of some kind of. It is indicative of some kind of political mischievousness.
Well, they're exploiting the event after it happened doesn't necessarily mean that they caused the event. It just means that something happened.
Taking advantage of something, even if you take advantage of something without the consent or complete information to the public, that is still a conspiracy.
Uh,
Whether or not exploiting an event for political benefit and it's a secret,
but they exploit
that is the
all
definition of
whole
conspiracy.
events get exploited. Every single event that happens, people try to exploit. Like if there's a mass shooting, the people who are anti-gun, exploit it to promote their message, and the people who are pro-gun will try to spin it a different way. So that's just what politicians do.
Exactly, and okay, so like let's take the gun control example
Mm-hmm.
example. Say I am what is the anti-gun control, the NRA. So the NRA in the U.S. Say I'm on the board of executives at the NRA. A mass shooting has just happened. I collaborate with my team of PR agents and media publicists that are going to take advantage of the situation in order to get people to actually support gun rights more. Now, say that somehow inadvertently leads to people buying guns and another mass shooting happening. Now, hasn't the NRA technically committed a conspiracy because they did, in secret, decide to take advantage of a situation that turned out to have harmful outcomes to people? That is the definition of a conspiracy, when people get together in secret to plan a harmful or illegal act.
Well,
that's all it is. It's the precursor to almost every crime that we have. If two people make a crime to steal and they planned it, you also get charged with conspiracy to steal. Murder, conspiracy to murder. Anytime it's two or more people involved in a crime, it's either an illegal or harmful act, it's already labeled as conspiracy. So it's a more common thing than people think it is, and it's become such a misnomer and used as a pejorative to
I'm not really sure what your point is here, because
thought.
Everyone knows that conspiracies happen all the time. Like my book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole, the first words in the introduction are "conspiracies are very real," of course. And then I list a bunch of actual conspiracies, and everybody knows that people conspire, and everybody knows that politicians are not honest.
My point is basically that the assumption that people make, where I've personally, I watched your debate with Tony Zambotti from 8911, and you made the one point where you said he said he was implying that NIST cheated on their data. When they were not revealing the data for the collapse of WTC7 model, and to which you said that you're implying conspiracy here when incompetence is the better explanation, and I don't see why that is. Why is incompetence automatically the better explanation without any justification?
Because incompetence is a lot easier for people to do. A conspiracy, especially a very complex conspiracy involving a lot of people, is a very, very difficult thing. But to just mess up, or to be, just doing something because you can't be bothered to do it, or for some other reason, is a lot simpler. It's just, all they did was they did nothing. They didn't release the data, and then when they were asked to release the data, they said, we don't want to release the data because it's, people might use it to destroy other buildings. Maybe they could have released it. Who knows? But having a conspiracy
for that logical fallacy, where you just would prefer to go with the easier solution that makes more sense to you subjectively.
No, it's Occam's razor.
Actually, both alternatives, especially when it comes to a political act like this, when, like you said, conspiracies are known to happen, and they do happen within the political atmosphere, the economic atmosphere. We do know they happen. So why should we just automatically dismiss the possibility of conspiracy and say that it has to be incompetence?
I wouldn't dismiss it. I would just rank it appropriately. I would say the more likely explanation is incompetence. Now, I mentioned Occam's razor, which is like a logical tool, and people often think that Occam's razor means the simplest explanation is the best. But it's not. It's slightly more complicated than that. Occam's razor says you shouldn't have to add things to an explanation. Do not multiply the entities required more than is necessary. So you do. If you find that you have to add something to an explanation, then the explanation that doesn't require things adding to it is usually the one that's more likely to be correct. It's not always the case, but like with with releasing the data, NIST didn't release the data behind the global models for the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Now, on one hand, the suggestion is just that I'm not saying incompetence is a good thing there, but they just didn't want to release it because they thought that it was dangerous. On the other hand, you're saying that they didn't release it because there's a huge conspiracy and that the buildings were actually destroyed by controlled demolition. So you're having to add this incredibly huge
that's a bit
assumption
of exaggeration of my position. Not that just that one point is indicative of a huge conspiracy. It's just, to me, it's suspicious, yes, that they would decide to hide that data and claim it as matters of national security, which is actually not, as far as reasons for keeping stuff classified goes, is not a bad reason. I understand the reasoning for it, that perhaps future terrorists may get a hold of that and use it as a way to expose weaknesses in other buildings. But my counter to that argument is, why don't they release it so engineers know how to build their buildings differently to safeguard against attacks like that?
Well, that's kind of like
if they're able to reveal the weaknesses in the building with the data, couldn't they just alter how they design buildings so that they don't fall the way they did?
They could, but I think the problem there is it's similar with computer programming. If there's a thing called a zero-day exploit, where if someone finds a bug in some software and then they release the information about the bug, hackers will get that information, and on the first day, the 0th day, they will be able to create an exploit and hack into everybody's systems, because it takes a long time for people to patch all their systems when they're all different. It's a lot quicker than creating new buildings or retrofitting buildings. But you can't just say, oh yeah, we've discovered that if you just plant one explosive at a certain column, then it will destroy pretty much like any building of this type, and just tell everybody that, and then say, well, you all got to go and fix this now. You wouldn't do that publicly. If there was such an issue, then you would want to do it very privately and get it taken care of. I personally don't think that they really had a very good case for keeping the data private. I think it was just basically they just chose the default option from their perspective. Someone said, well, maybe there is some kind of problem with this. Maybe there's some national security issue, so we shouldn't release it. And once that thing became set, then they just didn't. There was no way it was going to change. Because there's no incentive for anybody to do the work.
I'll agree with you on that. That could have been a case of just bureaucracy and incompetence over there, and I'll agree with you that could have been either way. And that's the thing, though, with a lot of these things, when it comes to regarding incompetency versus conspiracy, I mean, either way we talk about it is just speculation from your stance or my stance. So we really just have to look at the facts and what the
information. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Looking at the facts, but. Going back to what I was saying earlier, people have been looking at the facts for 18 years. Now, you made a point earlier, you thought that the collapse of the building breaks the laws of physics. If the official explanation is correct, you think it breaks the laws of physics because of the Newton's laws of motion and path of least resistance and things like that. And these seem fairly straightforward to you. You've got school education in physics. But if it's been 18 years and we've all been looking at the same videos and things of the collapses of the buildings, why hasn't that become accepted truth? I mean, there's literally millions, tens of millions of people who have your level of understanding of physics or better. There's probably right now 100,000 students around the world who are studying physics and who know physics better than you and I do. And they should be able to figure this out. Hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in the professional sphere, tens of millions of people, not just in this country, in other countries too.
I answered that. Like I said, it's just mainly most people just don't have the interest to look in the subject, or they
really?
Don't have the second thought to think to look into it. And that's just it. I don't think there's some giant. There is at some point, when it comes to propaganda and PR and psyops, there is some kind of an effort. And I'm not just talking about 9/11. I'm talking about any kind of world event. We know that from Noam Chomsky's propaganda model, how the news works, the 5 propaganda filters through flak advertisers and all that, about how the media, at least corporate media, is owned through their shareholders, their advertisers,
So you think
and
the whole
synergy with other
world,
companies, like say,
the whole world has been brainwashed? Like all the people in China have been brainwashed, all the people in, Japan,
but yeah,
Korea, Africa, South America.
that's actually a good point because Japan, well, there was a congressman a few years ago who brought it up in Japanese parliament that they need to look into it. Same thing happened in Amsterdam. People have over the world looked into it. It's just that sometimes this news isn't front page stuff, top of the YouTube suggested feed, if you get what I mean.
But
Some of
looking
these
at,
things just aren't that accessible to
but you're
people,
a
and that's
specific
not.
example though of the laws of physics type thing. You're sticking by that as being actual evidence, and yet,
Yeah.
like I said, there's tens of millions of people, and you think they've all just somehow been brainwashed into not caring about it, and so they don't see.
No,
I mean,
no, no,
if I could
like I
figure that
said, no.
out, if I could figure that out, that would be the most
That's
amazing thing ever,
Vic,
and I would tell everybody about it.
Vic, that's a straw man argument. I'm not saying that tons of millions of people have been brainwashed to believe that the wrong laws of physics have taken place. I'm saying tens of millions of people haven't even had thought of whether it has or not. They haven't decided whether it follows the laws of physics or not. They just haven't looked into it, and
But
it's
they're
as simple
being
as that. It's just like I
brainwashed.
said. It's ignorance, but it's not willful
Hmm.
ignorance. It's just okay. I like, for example, do you know how to cure cobra bite venom poison? Did you ever look it up?
No.
Exactly. So there's tens of millions of people in the world who could potentially get bitten by cobras, yet they don't know how to cure it.
Yeah,
It's
but
just that
that's a
simple.
very
Some
different
people
type of
just haven't
thing.
looked into it because they don't have the interest.
Where,
I mean,
well,
yes,
yes,
it is a different thing, but like on
you.
on the topic of subjects, not everyone is interested in the same topics, and that's okay to me. That everyone in the world isn't concerned with 9/11. It's not about how many people are onto a topic. It's about the actual content of the argument. It isn't about a popularity contest. It's about, so many people don't know this is happening. That must mean it isn't true. That isn't true. Was it back when whatever physicist it was that suggested that light actually bounces into our eyes? He was considered crazy for so long for suggesting that light actually bounced into our eyes from other objects, when everyone was thinking that, light just shot out from our eyes. And that despite the fact that there's so many people who could potentially learn the physics that he learned in order to figure it out, they didn't, because either they didn't have the information, they didn't have the access to the information, or they just weren't interested to find it out because they never thought to. And that isn't indicative of brainwashing or anything. That's just basic human ignorance, and that's not their fault.
But the stuff
it's
you're
no one's
talking
fault.
about, the stuff you're talking about, isn't really like a paradigm shift, to use a phrase. Like it's not. You're saying it's very basic physics that we're talking about here. Like it's simply Newton's laws of motion that prove that the building could not have collapsed the way it did without explosives. And surely,
Yeah,
if
and
someone could actually,
it's
does that prove that it was controlled demolition?
no, it doesn't prove that it was controlled demolition outright. All it does is it says that the official NIST report has inconsistencies and contradictions in it that merits a reopening of an investigation that from a neutral, private third party that isn't funded by the government to have a potential conflict of interest.
So do you think that there's a way the buildings could have collapsed without explosives that you're just not aware of?
I mean, it's possible, but do you think it's also possible the buildings could have come down due to controlled demolitions despite NIST having not tested for them?
So you don't think you have proof of controlled demolition? You just think whether there's indications or questions?
Like I said, I think it's firstly like NIST hadn't tested for explosives, which they need to, and there is
someone else
evidence
would
just
test.
that controlled demolition should have been tested for, and that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that there's definitive proof that it was controlled demolition. I'm not an investigator. I'm not going to speculate as to what actually happened. I'm just asking questions, and these are my doubts. And I think another investigation needs to be done. I can't say exactly what happened. I'm not omniscient. I don't know all the answers.
Do you think another investigation will be done?
I honestly, I'm doubtful of that. I think unless there is a concerted effort worldwide to actually get another investigation, and I don't think there will be, And I do agree that, like I said, the 9/11 truth movement hasn't made many great strides, and that's partially just due to the taboo of the topic mainly. And that's not, some of it's intentional, some of it is just human nature, some of it is just ignorance, and like I said, that isn't their fault. There's just a lot of stories that just don't get big despite actually being of value to certain people.
Yeah.
That just happens. That's how the media is. Some people have different interests and can't always satisfy everyone. I mean, and 18 years isn't even that long. I mean, look at proven conspiracies in history that have been declassified, such as Operation Northwoods, or the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, or Operation Mockingbird, or Operation Paperclip. Like, some of those took 40 years to come out. People had been speculating that Nazis had come into the country under Operation Paperclip for a while. They were considered loony, and everyone's like, oh, how come there's no proof for that? Turns out, later, 40, 50 years after, they do finally declassify the documents, and then that gets revealed as truth. So 18 years in that kind of field, especially when it comes to declassification of official conspiracies, 18 years isn't that long of a time at all.
Mm-hmm. But here, like, it's kind of a different situation because we have all the evidence more or less out in plain sight, like especially with the physics of things. Like you would say, like you can look at the buildings themselves. You have all these architects and engineers, and they have these mission statements, position statements, where they say why they believe, and they say, oh, it was obvious to me from day one that the buildings could not have collapsed. And so it's not really the same type of thing as like people suspecting that German scientists were brought over after the war, which obviously would have been a secret operation. And some of the other stuff you mentioned, there was conspiracies. Well, obviously there are conspiracies, and they got revealed later, but they weren't really conspiracy theories in the same way that people were speculating that Operation Northwoods was a thing. Until it actually came out, I think, in a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, at some point. So, I think
Operation Mockingbird is actually a good example of something that was speculated for a long time. Operation Mockingbird was the infiltration of the CIA into various media organizations during the either started in the 1920s or 1940s. Can't remember which one of those years, but one of them. And that went on for a long time, up until it was revealed in the Church Committee congressional hearings, where Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA at the time, had to reveal things about, turned out that they had agents in about 40 of the biggest newspapers in America, and including their affiliates such as radio stations, something like 2,000 radio stations, and all of that, and that went on for like 30 to 40 years with the whole McCarthyism Red Scare. So we do know that propaganda is a big thing.
Yeah,
we do know
that was something that actually got revealed though, and was declared to be illegal, and like they say they don't do it anymore. Like
after about 30 years of doing it, then there was the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where all these African Americans were getting sick with syphilis. Obviously, there was going to be some speculation that, the government's making us sick. Obviously, people are going to make that conspiracy theory up, right? Because that's how conspiracy theories go. People think of all things. So there must have been someone in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment who must have speculated that, they're making us sick.
Yeah.
It would have just been speculated.
No, I see what you're saying is that you see no reason to trust the government or people in power because they have done things in the past that were bad.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that's good reason to be wary of them. I'm not saying not to trust them. I actually trust the government with a lot of things. Funnily enough, a friend of mine is very anti-government, kind of anarchist. I'm more like, we kind of need the government. Like, I see it as a vital part of civil discourse and democracy. Like, government isn't always bad. I trust a lot of government officials that actually would like to vote. I just think that there are dishonest people.
Oh yeah,
there are certain sectors
that
that are dishonest. And just like anything, I don't think the whole thing is like one giant big conspiracy. Like, that's the one thing that I don't appreciate is about a lot of the people who claim to debunk or claim to be skeptical, is that they kind of strawman it and twist it as, it's just this big giant conspiracy. When, no, conspiracies do happen, small ones do happen, and sometimes they can be a little bit more tightly knit than you could imagine, especially like say if this was a military operation, you're going to have people with the highest class security clearances, people with the highest levels of confidentiality. It's really not that hard to imagine that it could be kept a secret when you have literal procedures or standard operating procedures to keep secrets.
Yeah. Now, this is obviously these are arguments that have been made before that it could be compartmentalized, but then you look at what would be involved in doing that. The FBI, basically put at least half of their personnel into investigating 9/11. So there was somehow to have to prevent the entire FBI machine over several years from discovering any evidence. They had iron workers and firemen on site for like a year, sifting through the evidence, looking for remains of people. So they'd have to make sure that no fireman ever found any evidence, and if he did find some evidence, he would have to be dealt with. It's not quite as easy as I think you might think it is to cover up controlled demolition. Sure, you could say that they arranged for the plane to fly it.
But you just made a very bad hypothetical scenario there where an FBI agent would have to silence a firefighter at ground zero for evidence that they found. Firefighters were all over, and it was, like, as you say, it was a hectic, extraordinary day. I can't imagine that firefighters would be busy. Like, their main priority that day would be saving lives.
Not that day. Over the next year, firefighters were on site every day for the next year.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Sifting through the wreckage.
That was, my mistake. My mistake. I misinterpreted you there. But
so somehow they'd have to clean up the site.
We do know that a lot of the evidence from Ground Zero. We do know a lot of the evidence from Ground Zero was shipped off to China almost immediately and destroyed.
Well, I think almost immediately is a bit of a misnomer, because it wasn't, because the last column in World Trade Center was standing I can't remember, it was like at least 6 months later. And so you basically had hundreds of firemen, hundreds of workers sifting through the wreckage.
Understand. But even then, what do you expect firefighters to see with the naked eye that would be that incriminating? As I said, they did see molten metal. They did claim to hear explosions. So we do know that these people who have made testimonies are making testimonies. There's a lot of them.
But no one found anything.
As potential whistleblowers. So the case that you make that they would all be silenced and whatnot, like, that's not the case, because they're not being silenced. You have whistleblowers in all fields. By that logic, if everyone was to be silenced, we wouldn't have any whistleblowers.
But nobody found anything in the debris that was indicative of a controlled demolition. No fireman came forward. No FBI agent, sifting through the wreckage at Fresh Kills, came forward and said, "Yeah, I found this detonator."
What would they find? What would they be able to see with the naked eye?
Well, you think that everything was just turned to dust? There was every single explosive charge went off. Obviously, it kind of didn't go off if NIST, not NIST, if AE 9/11 is to believe, because they say there's this red dust throughout all the dust, which is indicative of unreactive thermite. So some significant portion of the thermite did not go off.
That's besides my point. And that thermite, apparently, I don't want to get into that, because that's a topic I'm not too sure about. So I only want to talk about things that I do know.
Detonators.
From what I understand,
detonators.
Even with that would have to be tested under a microscope. My point is, what would they see at ground zero with the naked eye that would be indicative? That could look any different from a regular fire to signs of explosives. I would imagine to the naked eye, there wouldn't be too much of a difference to the naked eye.
You would see cut columns that had been deliberately cut. And if you read there's a good book, I can't remember what it's called right now, but it's a guy called Vicious, I think, and he talks about how he looked at all the columns on 9/11 and he saw that they came apart at the welds, they snapped at the welds, basically. They weren't cut by explosives. There was nothing to indicate that they're being cut by explosives. And you can see this in the photos yourself. You can look at the photos, from the day even, but in the next few days, you can see the ends of the columns. They just snapped apart. There wasn't any really need for explosives. So you would expect to see, if explosives were used, they don't just push things around. They break things in a certain way. and you would be able to see that damage. And there was lots of iron workers there who would understand how iron works. The people there who were like cutting up the columns and pulling them out of the ground, loading them onto trucks. They would have to, they I think would see if there was any evidence. But anyway.
I don't know. I've read testimony from mine workers who claim otherwise, but I guess
send that to me.
To you that would just be speculation and not credible, right?
No, I'd be happy to see it. Testimony from iron workers. Because what I've seen is, obviously on the day, like, there was loud bangs because there was the large building falling down.
Yeah,
floors collapsing.
Yeah, I've seen. Have you? There's videos of iron workers with steel columns from 9/11 bent in a perfect horseshoe shape with the cut columns that you described. And by the way, I have seen that people have tried to pass off some of the columns as being cut, but they're actually done after the welders have cut them in order to clear the debris. So I do know that, and that's why I like to point out work on your site that does debunk things that are actually bunk.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
So things like that. Do make sense. And all I'm saying is that there are some sources, like I said.
So you're saying that there are whistleblowers,
there are firefighters who have claimed. Yes, there are some, and all I'm saying is that they probably just aren't heard about. Do you know about I was trying to think about. Okay, basically, do you know every whistleblower there is to know?
No, actually, I don't really follow the whistleblowers that much.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah. Well, I would say that following whistleblowers is something you should consider doing in your.
And the reason I don't
debunking.
though is that when I look into one of them, they don't generally seem to be that credible, and their explanations are confused and they don't really fit the timeline. There was like the guy who thought there was bombs in the basement. He was the caretaker guy, last man out, and then there was the African American guy who was in World Trade Center 7. That guy, he gives an account of coming down into the lobby and stepping over bodies in the lobby, and there weren't any bodies in the lobby, and yet he's being lauded as being this whistleblower, this guy who explains that there were explosions before World Trade Center 2 collapsed, and people point to him and say, "Look, this is evidence," but he got it wrong, but people still point to him. And the other guy, it's a similar type of thing. There were explosions in the lobby. He says they were before the planes hit, like everybody else says that they were after the planes hit. And so it doesn't make any sense that there would be explosions in the lobby before the planes hit anyway. And it would be very, very obvious if that had actually happened, and lots of people would have been witnesses to it. But it doesn't hold up.
I personally don't know who I personally don't know who you're talking about, so I wouldn't be able to verify those or not.
I'm terrible with names.
There are certain whistleblowers like William Binney, former NSA technical director. He's also a mathematician, and he basically is in disagreement with this finding of the collapse of the buildings.
Yeah, and you can always find somebody who will take a certain position, but unless they can actually come up with some different evidence or a good analysis of that evidence, they're really just working with the same set of data as we are. Like the architects and engineers, if you read what they say in their position statements, they're really no different to just your average person who's watched a few videos and has come to the conclusion, except they happen to be architects.
That's highly dismissive.
No, it's. I've read a lot of these position statements, and I encourage other people to do it too. And they are all very similar. They're all just like, oh, I saw it and I immediately knew that it was impossible. It's like they have very little data, or they say they later saw some video, like they saw loose change, and then they were convinced because they watched loose change. The architects and engineers seem to have very similar routes into belief that regular people have. Like they will watch a video, or they had an immediate response when they saw the towers fall that they couldn't believe that it was happening. It looked really weird. The explosions were strange. The way the towers exploded outwards. So they don't really seem that different to regular people.
So you would say that someone like Tony Zambotti, who you had a debate with, has only just watched a movie or so. And
No. He's obviously he's done a lot of stuff, but I think his belief is
he did a very in-depth analysis about the girders and how.
Oh yeah.
I watched the debate with you and him, and it didn't seem like he just watched a movie and came to a decision about 9/11. Because I've watched a bunch of testimony on AE 9/11, and a lot of them are pretty knowledgeable. Like there's demolition technical loader, there's chemical engineers, there's people who do all sorts of things in AE 9/11. It's not just architects and engineers. There's chemical engineers, there's demolitions experts, there's architects, there's mechanical engineers.
But, we did
mathematicians, there's physicists.
I did a paper. I collaborated on a paper about chemtrails a few years ago, and we asked a bunch of scientists, whether they thought there was evidence for a secret spraying program like chemtrails, and we expected everyone to say no. I think we asked 77 people, and actually one guy said yes. He said that there was possibly evidence of chemtrails, and he wasn't convinced otherwise. And there are people with PhDs who think that chemtrails are real. And I don't know what your opinion is about the chemtrail conspiracy theory, but you can always find someone who will believe.
Chemtrails is a different example. Chemtrail is a different example. For example, if we were to go to the same group of people and ask them all for their belief in a religious deity, I bet you a lot more people would claim that than they would for chemtrails.
Yeah, but if 5% of people think that 9/11 was controlled demolition,
it's an irrelevant comparison. It doesn't matter what you compare it to or what other things people believe in. We're talking about just 9/11 here.
Right. But my point is, you can always find somebody to believe in whatever your theory is. There'll always be a percentage of people who believe that a theory is correct, especially if it's presented in a compelling way, like if there's
agreed.
Good videos or whatever.
Agreed. And that's to sum up that NIST, the official version of the story, and NIST version, they're all also theories. They are just a government-sponsored conspiracy theory.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. The official story is essentially a conspiracy theory because it posits a conspiracy amongst the terrorists.
Yes, and it posits a theory of how they did it because, like you said, there's unanswered questions. They don't know everything, so therefore, since they don't know everything, it is just a theory based on their understanding of how it happened of a conspiracy. So it is the government-sponsored conspiracy theory.
Yeah. Oh, this has been going on for.
You must be aware of RussiaGate. This is a good example of government-sponsored conspiracy.
Would you say government-sponsored conspiracy theory? I mean, like Donald Trump is part of the government. He's not sponsoring it. That's fair. I mean,
it's part of the government. Well, you could say bipartisan sponsored conspiracy theory. I mean, from the Democrats. Then you have it from the mainstream media, who are pushing it to people like on shows like NBC and whatnot. So they were pushing the whole. So what essentially was Russia and Trump got together, conspired that they were going to affect the elections, which is illegal, in secret, which is a conspiracy theory. And they had been pushing this narrative for a long time, and a lot of people believed in it. And so my question to you is, just like you asked me, if the 9/11 thing is true, how come so many people don't believe it? My question to you is, so now we know RussiaGate is false, the Mueller report has come out. How did so many people believe something so untrue?
Well, I think it seemed very plausible at the time, because we know that Russia did interfere in the elections, and we know that things happened, like, they had meetings with Russian people, not necessarily to discuss that. And we know the Mueller report didn't exonerate Trump from collusion. He just said that collusion was not proven. He didn't say it didn't happen. He's just saying there isn't enough evidence for him to bring a prosecution. It's probably something we should continue to look at. And we know, like I say, the Russians did actually do a significant amount of work trying to affect the election.
The controlled demolition. You can't say that controlled demolition didn't happen, because all that we've known is that they didn't test for it completely. So there is no way to say that it didn't completely happen, which is the exact same scenario.
We can say that it wasn't necessary for the buildings to collapse based on our analysis of the structures of the buildings. that a fire would actually cause this type of collapse, and this is what it would look like. And there's really no, well, from my perspective, and from most of the scientists that I've talked to about it, and obviously NIST, the fire-induced collapse explains what we saw, and you're saying that it doesn't explain what we saw, or at least that not fully in your mind. But so I don't really think it's the same type of thing as was there a conspiracy by Trump to collude with the Russians?
It can't explain. It can't explain why we collapsed because, as I said, they didn't test all the hypotheses. They narrowed their field of scope. And
it's a hypothesis that is plausible.
Went down the road that was most complicit with the story that would benefit the government, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to have to. It's been very, very interesting talking to you, but I do have to cut it off at some point. We're at an hour and a half now, which is a bit longer than my normal podcasts, and I do have to go.
Oh,
but
I hadn't realized it went on for so long.
Yeah, it's always very interesting talking to people like you. You don't realize how long you can talk about these things, but there's so much in it. There's so many different topics. But that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier.
A lot of content, and
we're regurgitating stuff here. We're going over arguments that have been gone over before many, many times, and to some extent, maybe you're educating me about things I'm missing, and maybe I'm trying to educate you about things that I think you're missing. But these are things that have been going on and on for years, for ever since the start. People have been having these discussions, and I don't really know how it's going to change, because I don't think there's going to be a new investigation, and I don't think when Professor Hulse's report comes out on September the 3rd, I don't think that's really going to change anything. People will just nitpick it and point out problems with it. What's your feeling about what you personally are going to do regarding 9/11 in the future? Are you going to keep some kind of activism going, or just posting online? What's your plan?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. But yeah, again, I want to say, Mick, despite our differences, it's been a good experience to be on here, and I once again want to thank you for inviting me on. So it's been good to talk to you. Been good to clear some of the thoughts we have, some disagreements we have. It's helped me, and as you said, it's actually been educational to me in that maybe there's some things that I might need to reevaluate or look into further. And perhaps I hope that you also have the same experience, that maybe there's some things that you might need to reconsider or look into further as well. And so in the future, I would hope that I don't do any sort of formal activism. Let's say nothing formal or professional or semi-professional or anything like that. I would mainly just, because I run my own personal blog, and I think I would mainly just keep it to that. Maybe just if anyone in my friend circle, or if I do get a little bit more of exposure, if people read it, maybe they do. But no, actually, I mean, it really depends. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on what's at stake. Say if there actually is some movement to start a new investigation, sure, I'd support it. I'd sign up for it. I'd do a petition for a new investigation to be reopened.
All right. Yeah, well, maybe I wouldn't mind there being a new investigation, to be honest, because I think it would clarify things. I really don't think it's going to happen, though. I don't think that Hulse's investigation is going to provide any real impetus. I think 9/11 is just going to continue doing what they do, promoting the cause and raising money and trying to spread the word. But I don't think anything's really going to change. But we'll see. Maybe it will. And I think what I try to do is just basically try to look at individual things that are false and try to clarify them. And I think that moves everybody closer to the truth. I don't think there was a controlled demolition, but if there was, then by removing things that are false, it should make it more clear what actually happened. So that's what I'm going to try and do.
Yeah, and that's exactly why, like I said, I do think there is value in. There obviously is value in clearing falsities in any kind of argument or report or study, but it's just the problem of while there are people who do see conspiracies everywhere, and I would say honestly, it's really only 9/11 mainly that, and like obviously when it comes to media propaganda and stuff, but those things are actually documented, like the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. Like those aren't conspiracy theories; those are actually like proper media facts that we have in the political landscape. Whereas, so I'd say 9/11 is probably the only one.
Yeah, we can talk about that type of thing some other time, because I like broadening out into other topics besides 9/11. But anyway, I want to thank you very much.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to finish off saying before we end?
Yeah. I was just trying to finish off what I was trying to say. Yeah. Okay. So basically, while there are people who see conspiracies everywhere, I do think that there are also people who just dismiss everything out of hand. And I think that we just need to be careful of being critical, especially when it comes to things that are conspiracy related. I mean, if you dismiss everything because it happens to be of a conspiratorial nature, then people who do conspire will inevitably get away with them much easier.
Yeah, I certainly encourage people to be vigilant of their own governments, because people have been shown in the past to do bad things, and we should keep an eye on the people in power. All right. Well, thank you very much.
But yeah, it's been good to be on with you, Mick. Thank you for inviting me on again. And, have a good day.
Yeah, you too.